Welcome. Wherever you are in these Zoom times, we welcome you to week 3 of UCLA Arts 10 Questions Reckoning 2020. Today, our invited guests gathered to respond to the question, what is power? However, in the style of Isaac Bryan, the extraordinary speaker from last week's discussion on what is justice, I'd like to begin by subverting the weekly form of our question, what is power, to what isn't about power? Person to community, person to place, individual to nation, community to nation, nation to nation, and the list goes on. In fact, is there a place in our interactions that is ever divided and for the benefit of whom? In what ways are the dynamics of power shifting in our society right now? Are there models of shared power? If so, who has access to these models and who must fight for access? Can listening and being present for one another be a form of power? Let's remember Cornel West's words, never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. Let's consider that justice rests on the ways in which power is contested, shared, or restored. As I introduce this evening, I want to speak especially to you students, those enrolled in 10 questions, and to all who are gathered this evening and who are quite simply students of life. How powerful you are. There is no doubt that you have many teachers, as do I, but to be a student, among the many other things you are, son, daughter, parent, sibling, friend, colleague, to be a student is a powerful and dynamic state of being, filled with the possibility for growth and the opportunity to make change. As a student, you are operating with new and also familiar knowledge, connecting your experience to an ever expanding view of the world around you and beyond you. You are considering how your actions contribute to and also change what is around you. You have the opportunity to choose your life rather than to have it chosen for you. This is power. And if some of you feel that the perception of choice is only an illusion, I offer then the words of a great teacher, Audre Lorde, the artist, writer, and activist who is also the subject of study in our course this week. In her essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury, Audre Lorde suggests we counter the Eurocentric Cartesian claim, I think, therefore I am, with the liberational call of the Black poet, I feel, therefore I can be free. Lorde talks about the power of the individual to dream, that cherishing feelings is to, in quote, respect those hidden sources of power from where true knowledge and therefore lasting action comes, unquote. Equating dreaming and poetry, she continues, poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, and then into more tangible action. As we build on last week's discussion about the power of the arts to move us towards justice, to make change in the world, I think that Audre Lorde would firmly insist that the arts, poetry, and the material of dreams, of feeling, is the very foundation of power, the foundation of possibility made real. Though we are far apart, in joining together from our homes, workspaces, and the other places in which we shelter, we have come together to dream, to expand our perspective, and to seek threads of connection. Our work tonight is not to find an answer to the question, what is power, but rather to consider the ways in which power operates in all of our relationships, in our institutions, and in our profoundly interdependent natural and human-made systems. To the student in all of us, the words of Nelson Mandela: our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. For those who are joining for the first time, 10 Questions is an academic course offered by UCLA School of the Arts and Architecture, and simultaneously a public platform for thoughtful engagement with our extended community. While COVID-19 has prevented us from meeting together in the same room, it is inviting us to be a university without walls, building bridges through our various screens wherever we shelter. It is here with you that 10 Questions brings together the treasured resources of the university, our teachers, our students, and our community to build capacity in this time of urgent need and great precarity. The format for this evening will include a 10-minute presentation from each of our panelists, followed by a conversation amongst them. Our students will then immediately gather in small group discussions in Zoom breakout rooms, and tonight, different from previous weeks, everyone else will remain in the webinar for a very special presentation. We will then welcome our students back and finish out the evening with a question and answer with our esteemed guests. So let me introduce our first esteemed guest, Jemima Pierre. Jamima is an associate professor of African American Studies and Anthropology at UCLA. Her research and teaching interests are located in the overlaps between African studies and African diaspora studies, and engage race and political economy, transnationalism and diaspora, and the cultural politics of knowledge production. Welcome, Jamima.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here with you all tonight. I'm going to present my paper right now, I guess. What is power? Let me begin with a couple of questions about power and its exercise, and also about resistance to power. The questions are, how do we understand power in a context where power is defined by and through race? And how do we begin to understand and indeed enact the forms, strategies, tactics of resistance to power as race and to the exercise of power through a racial state? For me, some answers to these questions can be found by thinking through the words of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Douglass gives us one of the most eloquent and most popular descriptions of power and of resistance. First slide, please. In an 1857 speech, Douglass stated, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." It is a stark, almost raw statement, And it begins to help to understand the idea of power as something that is not static or timeless. Douglass, of course, was born into slavery. After he emancipated himself, he became an activist who wrote and spoke against the institution of slavery and the evils of enslavement, led the abolition fight for emancipation, and was a suffragist. Douglass's activism was shaped by the view that Black people in the US were in constant confrontation with an immoral power structure, that is, US state power. This is crucial, for it points us to the idea that not all authority is moral, even when it is exercised through the vulnerable and ancient venerable and ancient institutions of the state that we have taken for granted as impartial, legitimate, and fair. Indeed, for Douglass, we can see that the immorality of state power in the US is due to the differential treatment of racial groups and its role in furthering and maintaining racial hierarchies. In this sense, it should be clear that the US is what philosopher David Goldberg calls a racial state. If a state's power is reflected in the capacity to regulate behavior, to impose and enforce order through its institutions, US state power operates through ideas of race. Race is integral to the conceptual, philosophical, and material emergence of the United States. The country's institutions are vectors for racialized forms of power and domination and of white supremacy. White supremacy is, as philosopher Francis Lee Ansley contends, a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. This broad system includes widespread conscious and unconscious idea of white superiority and entitlement, as well as relations of white dominance and non-white subordinations reenacted daily across a broad array of institutions and social settings. White supremacy, therefore, speaks to a rigid nexus of power, the structural dynamics inherent in the hierarchical construction of race and of whiteness as a top power position. It is the political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. The power of white supremacy lies in the formation of the US nation state and the state's creation and enforcement of the material realities of inequality through native dispossession and African enslavement, of racial oppression and of economic exploitation. White supremacy is therefore built into the economy, the political system, the law, with particular economic activities and political privilege reserved for members of the settler population. And in our time, it has continued to be articulated through community norms, scientific and medical categorizations, residential, educational, or occupational segregation, and the racial images and ideologies of the media, popular culture, and science. As a result, the structures of white supremacy initiated and sanctioned by state power have meant incalculable racial terror and a continuous struggle against numerous systems of oppression for non-white populations, and specifically for people of African descent. Policing in the prison industrial complex, the inequitable healthcare system, and unequal educational, social, and economic apparatuses. For Frederick Douglass, as for other activists of his time, an entrenched white supremacist state power demanded confrontation. He witnessed and understood the meaning of civil war and of emancipation, and recognized the hope of the radically democratic experiment of Reconstruction. But he would also live through the beginnings of the repression, a counter-revolution, if you will, against this radical democratic experiment, the betrayal and undoing of Reconstruction, and the birth of post-slavery apartheid. One of the things we can learn from history, in the particular history of the US as a racial state, is that every revolution to ensure equality has a counter-revolution. And that counter-revolution is structured through racial animus and the attempted reassertion of power through white supremacy with revanchist fervor. Thus, following the Civil War and the adoption of the 13th Amendment, Most states of the former Confederacy adopted Black Code laws modeled on former slave laws. These laws were intended to limit the new freedom of emancipated African Americans by restricting their movement and by forcing them into a labor economy based on low wages and debt peonage. The Black codes laid the foundation for the set of laws and customs supporting a system of white supremacy that would be known as Jim Crow, the separate but equal standard established by the US Supreme Court in the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which was to enforce racial segregation for public facilities across the nation. Here we see then the deployment of state power in enforcing the white counter-revolutionary politics in the historical trajectories of anti-Black racism. Under the cover of white supremacist state power, the period between emancipation and arguably the revolutionary potential of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 saw extreme backlash and repression against African Americans. State-sanctioned judicial and extrajudicial violence, especially extreme individual vigilante terrorism. Next slide, please. The continuous loss of legal victories was supplemented by this violence. Some of the key markers of this state-sanctioned terrorism was the lynching spree against African Americans from the late 1890s to the mid-1900s, and most notably, the 1919 Red Summer. Next slide, please. The Red Summer then is when confronting a national epidemic, the Red Summer is when confronting a national epidemic of white mob violence in 1919, Black Americans defended themselves and fought back, demanding full citizenship through numerous acts of resistance and courage. Next slide, please. In cities throughout the US, Charleston, South Carolina, Longview, Texas, Washington, DC, Omaha, Nebraska, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Elaine, Arkansas, white mobs attacked Black individuals and destroyed Black communities. In addition, white supremacists lynched nearly 100 Black people alone in 1919. Black people in 1919 alone. And the next two slides, please. The triggers for this white rage, historian Carol Anderson tells us, was not merely the presence of Black people, but the exercise of Black agency, with Black veterans returning from World War I, proudly wearing their military uniforms in public, with Black sharecroppers organizing in Arkansas for better wages, and with Black children swimming in the white section of Lake Michigan. In response to this mob violence, African Americans formed self-defense units and fought back. We return to Douglass here to help us understand that in the fight for revolutionary change, power only concedes as much as necessary to appease. And often it doesn't concede at all, which is why Douglass calls for making a demand of power through struggle and resistance. Next slide, please. He says, this struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those they oppress. African American response to the Red Summer forced a limit to the tyranny of state-sanctioned white supremacist power and repression. In July 1919, a young Black West Indian immigrant stood in front of his co-workers, the Black employees, the waiters and porters at the Pennsylvania Railroad dining car, and read to them his just finished poem, If We Must Die. Later, Claude McKay, the young Black poet, would describe his poem, he would describe how this poem exploded out of him in defiance of being demoralized by the gross anti-Black violence and the fear that it invoked in him and his co-workers. The poem of assertion, of resistance, of hope, so excited his co-workers and so resonated with the Black community that it was reprinted in dozens of African-American journals for decades. In this poem, McKay does not seek to hide his bitterness, does not quietly submit to injustice. Instead, he affirms his humanity, his own power, through a vigorous, though hopeful, resistance. Last slide, please. If we must die. If we must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our cursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave. And for their 1,000 blows deals one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderers, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jemima. I'm afraid I was just having some technical difficulties. Surprise, surprise. It's a different kind of power. I think given my substantial problems just now, I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm just going to shift to introduce our second guest, and I'll look forward to our discussion about your presentation in a moment. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce William Boyd. William Boyd is on the faculty of the UCLA School of Law and UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. His primary research and teaching interests are in energy law and regulation, climate change law and policy, and environmental law. Professor Boyd also has longstanding interest and experience in interdisciplinary field-based research on resource use and environmental change. Welcome, William.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Jamima, for that incredibly powerful presentation. And thank you all for the opportunity to be here. I'm really excited to be part of this. I want to focus tonight on two highly concentrated forms of state power. Two highly concentrated forms of power, state power and corporate power, and the role that law plays in enabling that power in the context of large land transactions around the world, or what some refer to as land grabs, and the implication of this for the looming climate emergency. Now, land is obviously one of the oldest and most important material bases for power, and land grabbing is hardly new. The entire colonial enterprise was one giant land grab. Our campus sits on land that was grabbed from the Tongva peoples. Land grabbing has been a key component of the creation and maintenance of class and racial domination. So everything I say tonight should be situated in the context of that longer history, but I want to focus specifically on the contemporary global land rush that has been underway for the last 15 years or so, and to try to tease out some of the distinctive features of this, asking what it tells us about the exercise of power in the world today and how it relates to the climate crisis. If I could have the first slide, please. So this is a carbon density map, and it shows tons of carbon per hectare, that is carbon in trees, plants, and soils per unit of area. And the darker green areas mean that there's more carbon per unit of area. And so you can see that the great remaining tropical forests of the Amazon, Central Africa, and Southeast Asia are the most carbon dense regions in the world. Deforestation in these regions and around the tropics currently accounts for around 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. These forests are vital sinks for removing CO2 from the atmosphere, and they're also home to more than half the world's terrestrial species and many of the world's indigenous peoples. If we lose these forests, we face ecological collapse. And now, even though we tend to think of climate change as an energy problem, and I'd be happy to talk about energy in the discussion, I think land and forests will turn out to be the hardest and most important part of the climate change challenge, both in terms of the difficulty of reducing emissions from land use, but also because of the deep connection that we have to land and the ways in which it is being disrupted by climate change. And we're seeing that right here now in California and around the West with the fires. We're seeing it, of course, around the world with fires, storms, floods, droughts, and heat waves that are forcing people from their homes, exacerbating subsistence crises, and leading to new forms of dispossession, mass migration, and violence. So I would argue that the contemporary global land question, that is the question of who owns and controls land, who gets to stay and who has to leave, and what happens on that land, is really central to the climate crisis, and that it provides an important way into this question that we're asking tonight: what is power? Let me give you a few facts. Could I have the next slide, please? This is the FAO Food Price Index, which is an index of global prices for a basket of food commodities. And the only thing I want you to notice here is the significant increase in food prices starting in the early 2000s. And we saw in 2007, 2008, and then again in 2011, food riots around the world because of these increases in food prices. There are a whole bunch of reasons for why this was happening, but this is also the moment that we start to see a big increase in very large land transactions or land grabs around the world. Next slide. This is an oil palm plantation in Papua, Indonesia, which is the Indonesian half of the island of New Guinea. This is part of a massive oil palm plantation complex in Papua, roughly 34,000 hectares or about 85,000 acres. Much of this was primary intact tropical forest before it was developed by a South Korean conglomerate. And just for comparison purposes, the UCLA campus, I think, is about 419 acres. What do we know about these land grabs? So estimates vary, but one study found that since 2006, large land transactions around the world have resulted in the transfer of at least 200 million hectares to mostly foreign buyers. How big is that? That's about 5 times the size of the entire state of California. Many of these land deals have been in Africa, but they've been happening all over the world, including here in North America. And much of this land is being dedicated to biofuels and food crops for export, such as palm oil. There are 2 main categories of buyers: national governments or government-backed entities from food insecure states that are seeking to enhance their own food security. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, South Korea and China have been major players there. And then there's a group of private corporate actors, including large firms in agribusiness and extractive industries, and investors such as private equity groups, pension funds, and other institutional investors who see global farmland as a promising financial investment. What happens on the ground, of course, these lands are not blank spaces. There are people living in all of these places. In order to make these land grabs possible, these people have to be removed, sometimes forcibly, often through formally legal means, but not always. And in the process, they're often pushed into states of dependency and vulnerability. Now, when I look at these land grabs, I see power operating at 3 main levels and across multiple dimensions. At the most general level, that is the level of the global economy or the world capitalist system, right? Power is operating through various structuring mechanisms. And these are the policies and legal frameworks that promote trade, investment, lending, and development. They create the enabling environment for corporations to move around the world and to make investments with relative ease and with significant protections. And they also, through periodic debt crises and imposition of structural adjustment, fiscal austerity, and privatization measures, exacerbate and compound situations of dependency for many sovereign governments, which in turn works to open them up as new frontiers for investment. There's also a second and a very important intermediate level of strategies and techniques where power is operating to make these investments possible. And I want to mention two here very briefly, financialization and offshoring. So financialization. So since the early 2000s, global farmland, and that's the term that is often used, has been financialized. That is, it has been carefully made into a new asset class for financial investment. And this has allowed for very large flows of finance to move into the sector. Many of you probably have retirement accounts and pension funds that include investments in global farmland, whether you know it or not. The second sort of strategy or tactic that I wanted to mention is offshoring. And this is related to financialization, but it's different. And here I'm referring to all of the sophisticated lawyering that goes on in places like the Cayman Islands that use offshore tax havens and shell companies to move money, to hide money, to make investments, and to structure ownership. And this world is all very opaque. It is invisible by design, but we've started to get a better view of this through the work of the International Center for Investigative Journalism and the various document leaks that have now been put online, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and others. Two quick examples, if I could have the next slide, please. This chart shows money flowing through various tax havens into the Brazilian soy and beef sectors from 2000 to 2011. These two sectors, soy and beef, are the big drivers of deforestation in Brazil. This is all based on these leaked documents and careful research that has documented or concluded that about 70% of all the investigated foreign investment in these sectors flowed through various tax havens. And this does a bunch of things, but in particular, it allows companies to avoid taxation, and it hides the actual source of the money in many cases. And we know that various pension funds and investment funds are using tax havens to move money into Brazil, for example. Next slide. And this is also from the leaked documents, and it demonstrates the use of the different layers of corporate shell companies that are used to hide ownership. And the only point I want to make here, I realize this is a busy slide, but the only point I want to make here is that if you look at the two Indonesian operating companies in green at the bottom of the document, right? These are the companies that are involved in land grabs on the ground and have been responsible for significant deforestation and dispossession. You have to go back through at least 5 layers of offshore corporate shell companies to get to the actual owner, which in this case happens to be a billionaire from Indonesia. And so the take home here is that this really makes it very difficult to make power visible. That is, when the entire effort is structured in a manner to make it invisible, it's very hard to see who's really responsible for what's happening. And this is how corporate power operates in much of the world today. As Saskia Sassen observes, the complexity of it all hides the brutality of it all. Next slide, please. Finally, there's a third level, and that's all of the work that happens at the domestic level in the so-called host country that removes people from the land, that clears the land, that creates the legal arrangements and the property rights that enclose the land. And there's a lot more to say here if we had time. At all of these levels, power is operating across multiple dimensions. And it's important to map these different dimensions as well as these different levels, right? The most direct and observable exercise of power is what happens on the ground, where state agencies and sometimes private actors remove people from land, sometimes by force, and enclose that land for investment. State power, though, is also mobilized to change the way that land is classified and governed, to declare that certain lands are state lands or underutilized lands or marginal lands or degraded lands, lands that are in need of foreign investment. And here we see a second dimension of power where the state is deciding how decisions about land will be made. It's setting the agenda and creating the legal framework that enables certain activities and claims to go forward while denying others. And then there's the third dimension, which is really the ideological level. And this is harder to investigate, but some of this is happening through narratives of development and progress, much of which is framed in a racial vernacular, as Jemima has written about. Much of it is also being framed in stark neo-Malthusian terms based on the idea that we're running up against natural limits in the face of a growing world population and shifting diets that is then compounded by widespread and intensifying climate disruption. And this narrative is often focused on low-income countries, particularly in Africa, and it sort of cashes out as a basic conviction that smallholder agriculture and small family farms are inefficient and in need of improvement, which then typically means removal and dispossession to make way for a new model of large-scale export-oriented agriculture. Let me just close with a few comments on politics. Next slide, please. People and communities on the front lines are resisting these land grabs, and people are losing their lives. More than 200 land and environmental defenders were murdered last year, according to Global Witness. The majority were in the Philippines, Colombia, and Brazil. There are also legal battles going on in many of these countries contesting these land grabs, and sometimes the courts have ruled in favor of local communities. There are other efforts underway at multiple levels and in different venues around the world to use law to hold or try to hold state and corporate actors accountable for these land grabs. But this doesn't happen by itself. And the last point I want to make is that sort of real and lasting structural change, meaningful legal reform at whatever level, almost always happens in response to protests and mass movements. Last slide, please. These are the youth climate marches from 2019 in LA, London, and Nairobi. And if we look around today or pre-pandemic, and hopefully soon after the pandemic is over, we see, I think, all over the world, new forms of climate solidarity emerging, led in many ways by the youth climate movement and by the generational rage that is powering that movement. And I see that movement together with the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests we saw across the United States and the world this summer as offering grounds for hope, as preparing the ground for possible structural change, for possibly taking back the state. In my view, any serious response to the climate emergency will require taking control of the levers of state power. And if we want to control, regulate, and tame corporate power, we'll need to use law and mobilize state power to do that. So the great question looming before us right now as we all begin to vote is, can we take back the power of the state to make it a truly responsive and reparative state, one that is capable of mounting a serious response to major problems such as systemic racism, coronavirus, and climate change? Thank you.
Thank you, William. You certainly give us plenty of reason to not only participate in systems in which our voice is heard, but to build larger coalitions, to find ways in which we can reach toward a common goal, because as you point out, corporate profit motives are invisibilized in so many ways, and it's going to take all of us to change things. Thank you. And I look forward to getting back to this subject in our discussion very shortly. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our third and final panelist, Chon Noriega, who is a professor of cinema and media studies and director of the Chicano Studies Research Center at UCLA. His research and teaching focuses on the arts, avant-garde film and video, the conjunction of film and television history, racial, gender, and sexual difference within both alternative and national cinemas, and media access for underrepresented groups. Welcome, Chon.
Thank you, Vic, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I'll start on a personal note to say that, first of all, let's put up the first slide. When I was invited to participate in 10 questions this fall, I was elated. I looked over the list of concepts, each one pulling at my academic heartstrings: presence, kindness, hope, loss, resilience, love, humor. How could I choose? So I reread the letter more closely, something I strongly recommend to you all. And I discovered that they had already determined I was ideally suited for the one I had skipped over: power. To tell you the truth, I suddenly felt powerless and accepted the invitation. After all, I wouldn't have to decide from among all the other options. Next slide. So what is power? This is easily answered. In Los Angeles, it is in the name of the nation's largest municipal utility, Department of Water and Power. Water is water, and power is electricity. There's even an international formula to measure the exchange of power: work divided by time. Power is considered a basic societal infrastructure like water, currency, transportation, and telecommunications. These are all ways of moving essential things within a society, whether energy, goods, people, value, or information. As such, basic infrastructures are always subject to direct state intervention, and the state's institutional control or oversight of them is one basis by which we understand a sovereign state as a power. The other basis is a state's claim of legitimate control over rulemaking and over the means of violence and coercion. Now, there's nothing inherent in either state power or electrical power. Neither can be stored effectively, and therefore power must keep moving, lest it be overpowered by something else. Now, this is textbook stuff. Next slide. What often gets overlooked is that power, that is, work divided by time, is not an absolute, but rather a concept by which we try to understand, measure, and regulate how people interact with each other. Power can be seen as articulated through the state, societal institutions, communities, the family, or a group of friends, or even strangers. But that somewhat misses the point too. Concepts are not things. Concepts are critical to thinking, but in the face of our ineffable reality, any concept is really a bucket with holes. The bucket is not reality, so reality will seep through our efforts to contain, measure, and predict phenomena, like power. Next slide, please. Now, I work in the arts. We take a different approach. It's not better, per se, but it does offer another perspective, one grounded in experience rather than analysis, empirical research, or rational choice models. That experience is physical, emotional, and even intellectual. The whole body is involved. Then again, that is always the case for everything, not just the arts. We are embodied beings. But see if you can find any indication of that in the Constitution of the United States, which is, after all, a plan for distributing and separating power. There is no kindness, hope, resilience, love, or humor. The word loss appears in the 14th Amendment in refusing any obligation for losses of former slave owners due to emancipation. The loss here is financial, the loss of people as property. The reasoning is based on the state reestablishing its power over rulemaking for the South. Next slide. The arts can be divided between those who make art and those professionals who engage with art, scholars, curators, critics, and the like. This arena is often seen as both outside state power and people power, reaching instead for the eternal, the sublime, and other ecstatic visions, or at the least, some edifying entertainment. This view of art is based on a premise about the sanctity of the relationship between the art object and the individual viewer. US art museums sell the arts on this intimate one-on-one experience, but they also brag about the 850 million visits they get every year and how that is almost double the attendance for all major league sporting events and theme parks combined. Do you see a contradiction here? The arts want to have a societal impact, but claim the impact as an individual one, located in civil society and protected by freedom of speech, which of course is protected by and from the state itself. But what about the role of the marketplace, class-based charitable giving, social protest movements, and those artistic practices that cannot be recuperated into the art world of museums, biennials, art fairs, and galleries? Next slide, please. In my own work, I write scholarly publications on cinema and media arts, but also on the visual and performing arts. In addition, I curate exhibitions and programs in these areas. My focus is primarily, but not exclusively, on art by Chicano, Latino, and even Latin American artists. For the most part, I put a spotlight on the art itself, as well as its historical context, rather than on the bucket. The bucket, in my case, let's call it Latinx art, since the term has currency in the art world right now. This bucket has a paradoxical feature to it in the United States. It embraces a multiracial, gender-neutral, pan-national community based on Latin American descent, but the bucket itself is premised upon the historical exclusion of this diverse group from US institutions that determine social, cultural, educational, economic, and political power. As a curator, I find myself trying to advocate for a category while also trying to break free from the underlying premise that it is an art of exclusion. That this art has nothing more to say than, you bastards have rendered 60 million people invisible within the realm of human expression, communication, and social knowledge. And that is true. But the bucket wants that statement to be the primary content and form of the art itself, when in fact, that problem resides with the art world, and the art world should take care of its own problems. Next slide. Early on as a scholar, I realized that I needed to do more than research and write about the art and artist I was drawn to. That is, explaining the work was not enough. I had to help bring the art into public view and permanent collections, and advocate for artists who were not being supported with grants, residencies, fellowships, and solo exhibitions. I have worked with a wide spectrum of institutions, including the Whitney Museum of American Art and El Museo del Barrio, both in New York City, and in Los Angeles, LACMA, and VPAM, the Vincent Price Art Museum at East LA College. I have helped establish a national pipeline program for the next generation of curators. And above all, I have tried to bring the experience of working within and across institutions back into my scholarship and curatorial work. But it was important for me not to do so as a gotcha moment, pulling the curtain back on the Wizard of Oz, his supremacy revealed, but instead, as something on the order of a reality check on my own thinking. Next slide, please. I've not been talking about the art I have shown, and there is a reason. Art can speak for itself. And if it is effective, it will lead you to engage further. Perhaps speak to the artist, read reviews, do research, talk to other people in the gallery, bring friends and family so they can share the experience with you. These two artists recycled domestic objects. On the left, an old and soiled carpet from the artist's childhood home. And on the right, the possessions of the first DACA status youth deported from the United States in early 2017, even though he grew up here. His mother loaned his belongings to the artist, yet never saw the exhibition out of fear for her own safety. These works are now in the collection, the permanent collection, of the two museums that hosted the exhibition, Home So Different, So Appealing. I co-curated it with Pilar Tompkins Rivas and Mari Carmen Ramirez. That these belongings from immigrant families are now in major art museums is a testament to the artist and their artworks, curators working against the grain, and histories of embodied human beings refusing to be erased, silenced, excluded, let alone defined by these acts of violence. You are looking at a painting and a sculpture. Next slide, please. I could speak at length about the processes by which art is made, shown, and circulated, but my time is up. So I will end here where I started. Power is electricity. The power of art is not neutral. The US military spends much more on arts than the National Endowment for the Arts. The canonical history of art is more or less the history of institutional power. But it can also be the history of envisioning other things, things that happened and things that could happen. Art can convince us to die for our country, dream about the future, or to live for a better present. The power of art is in its electricity, the transfer of energy and excitement from one place to another, from one person to another, the creation of a community that did not exist before, or the calling to presence of one that has always been there, but that we have been taught not to see, even as it grew to be the largest part of the us we equate with society. Thank you.
Thank you, Chon. Wow. I feel as though we could do some learning on how to see just by attending to what you shared with us just now, that we're looking at artwork as it also doubles and aligns with the ideas about energy and power that you've been talking about. And as well, reminding us that art is the evidence for lives that matter, and it exists on its own terms. So thank you for all of these ideas. I look forward now to parsing them with everyone. I'd love for all of us to join together as a group of 4. Thank you for these thoughtful presentations. I'd like for us to reflect on what we've heard and seen, and for you to have an opportunity to respond to each other's presentations with your thoughts, musings, observations, questions, whatever. So please, let's have a moment to speak amongst ourselves.
So I think it's my good fortune to try to go first here and get this conversation started. And I appreciate my fellow panelists in nominating me for that almost impossible task. I'm sort of blown away by what I've seen and heard, and really excited to be part of this, as I said. Jemima gave us a very powerful history of the racial state in the United States, and kind of showed us the pattern that seems to be kind of deeply hardwired into American history, where there may be some advances, some demands, some claims that are being made, and then then retrenchment, backlash, and violence. And I guess my question for you, Jamima, in this current moment, do you feel that state power in the United States could ever be kind of tamed and redirected, or is that really beyond our capability at this point? And do we need to be kind of thinking in a different register and along different lines there? Maybe I'll start with that and then see if Chon has anything he wants to interact with, but then I get to ask him a question too.
That's a very difficult question. When I realized I was doing this talk on power, the first thing that came to mind was this poem. And so my talk is structured around the poem, but also I'm thinking about the moment that we are at now, right? In terms of thinking about, the potential for, or the ongoing and potential for violence, especially, the resurgence of white supremacist violence in particular. So I'm not sure the state, the state is, you're absolutely right. The state is a racial state. It was designed and built, it was built as a racial state. How do you get out of that? And then that's a question for all of us. And I do think that's a conversation that our young generation, the people that are in the streets, asking for change, need to have, because what's always going to happen is the revolution, counter-revolution. And we've seen it over the past 400 years, right? Revolution, counter-revolution. So it is something to think about. And that's a great question, because I actually don't know how to answer it, except to say, it'd be great for all of us to think about, maybe to acknowledge the state for what it is as a racial state, and then find ways to get out of that where we are.
Yeah, there was an interesting article in terms of the use of white supremacy in the New York Times last weekend.
Yeah.
And you have one half of scholars looking at the issue of racial violence and white supremacy, saying to use that term shuts down the discussion, and others saying to use the word is to be accurate. And the New York Times itself, with a Black publisher or editor, is saying, we will not capitalize the word white, but we will capitalize the word Black. And we won't capitalize white because that's going to make people feel bad. because it has associations with white supremacy. So there's this really interesting issue in terms of the power of language to shut down or to mobilize. And I really, you know, it's very moving to have you end with a poem and to explain that you actually started with the poem, and to think about the role of poetry and the arts and why they are so important on both sides. Why has there never really been a effective social protest movement that didn't have art at the core of it, as a way of organizing people, giving them something to focus and get to get a sense of what they're doing and why, but also to communicate it to others. And that's different than writing an editorial.
Mm-hmm.
So
I wonder if I could jump in. I'm sorry if I'm stepping on your toes, William.
Not at all. Take it away.
You brought up the subject of language, and I'm just wondering if we could broaden that a little bit, not only to think about poetry as language, but just the words that we use, and how is it that those words contain and make static some of our expressed commitments to change. I'm sorry, Jamima, to jump back to you, but could you talk a little bit about even the ways in which certain words have codings about power inside of them?
Yes, I mean, it's hard. My research actually talks about language a lot in terms, especially in development research, and as my work is primarily in Africa, and just the development language that's in the word for that people use in development work, like capacity building, good governance, and all these things are very much coded language for African incompetence, basically. And there's a way that you have this language that happens that's always already, seeped in relations of power and domination. So it is an interesting thing to think about. But I guess for me, I don't know if anybody else has another point to say about words. White supremacy is a hard one. I mean, white supremacy you could not use white supremacy until after the summer, I think, for the most part, for a lot of people. And, I use white supremacy in my work from before, but I had to fight to use it, right? And it's really interesting, and because people will acknowledge that there's race and racism, but they won't acknowledge the power of whiteness, right? In a hierarchy. And I do think there's something that happened this summer that's forcing this kind of conversation around institutionalized and structural racism, which then you have to talk about the racial hierarchies that emerge out of that. So I do think, I feel hopeful about the moment, if only knowing that, there's always a counter revolution coming. So, but it is interesting to see the changing ways that we use words. So, but I wanted to ask William a question, if I could. So I was fascinated. Thank you. It was a great talk, and I really enjoyed it because I think about land grabs all the time, right? Especially Africa, because everybody's just going there, and and you think about the mining and the cobalt. But I was thinking about your claim that state power, control of state power, could be used to come, to make taking control of state power might be one of the ways to engage with or to deal with land grabs. And so I was on Twitter the other day, and the World Bank tweeted this thing about Bhutan, this beautiful space, and it said 71% of Bhutan's territory is covered in forest. But with a contribution of only 2% GDP per year, the forest sector remains underutilized. How can the country sustainably invest in its forests? And of course, this caused a major backlash, right? They're thinking, leave the people alone, leave Bhutan alone, leave its forest alone. This is the problem, right? So I wonder, what do you think about the role of, especially these formerly colonized spaces, the IMF and the World Bank, actually, their power surpassed state power. in some ways, in the same way that I think corporation power surpassed state power. And I wonder what you think, what that means for us when we see, corporations like Amazon and Google and Twitter becoming more and more powerful and wealthy. Is the control of state power, the thing for the future?
I guess I would say that I think the only way to tame and control corporate power is through law and state power. But I realize that that could be a double-edged sword, and that these things could go off the rails. And the concern, of course, is that state power is captured by an instrument of corporate power, and these large international financial institutions are essentially preparing the ground and creating the enabling environment for corporate power. And the whole neoliberal order, in many respects, it's all about government and statecraft. It's not about the market. It's actually about government and the role of government in maintaining space for corporate power to basically do essentially whatever they want, right? So I think the dilemma that we face, and I think I'm referring to state power at multiple levels here. I think there's a lot that the United States government can do to try to deal with the transparency and accountability issues around land grabs, to try to deal with some of the corporate accountability issues that they've been looking the other way on for a very long time. And that whole question of state power may be very different than state power on the ground, say in Brazil or in Indonesia. But in Indonesia, where I do some work, it's clear that people feel like the large corporate actors are far too powerful at this point, that the state is not powerful enough, the government is not powerful enough to really stand up for local people and communities against corporate power. I don't know what the alternative is, though. In other words, I don't see how we can actually push back against the concentration of corporate power without using law and the levers of the state. And I guess that was the sort of origins of my question to you. This is the dilemma we seem to be in some ways. It's that we, at least here in the United States, have this incredibly bloated and misshapen state where there's just this massive, carceral state and this machine for brutality and violence against Black people. And then this hollowed out kind of welfare state that is being further and further diminished. And then a total inability, it seems, to deal with major problems like coronavirus and climate change. And it seems to me, the big question is, can we get back to a view of the state and government that allows us to try to harness the power of the state to solve these big, complicated public problems? This is where I think John Dewey is still quite relevant, right? He talked about new publics coming into existence as we think about and try to solve problems together. And the state for him is the public articulated. And that all sounds romantic and idealistic at this point. But in this current moment, I do think, things are sort of up for grabs. And it's possible, right? By no means guaranteed, but possible that we could have a different kind of state and different sort of relationship with the state as we do kind of try to deal with some of these problems. And that could also take place at local levels as well. I mean, to go back to Chon's presentation in the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, that is a local municipally owned utility, right? It's the largest municipally owned utility in the country. Right. And that, it should be a vehicle for the people of Los Angeles to take their sort of systems of provisioning and infrastructure in different directions. And I think, the city of Los Angeles is now starting to think along different lines, perhaps with respect to climate change and things like that. But who knows if they'll stay with it. Right. And so it is, the oldest, I think, lesson from sort of Western political theory in some ways is that corruption and capture of government and of the state by powerful interests is something that is constant and that we have to be vigilant against.
That presumes that they once were not captured.
Right.
And I think that's
or
the
not,
argument of the racial state, is that it was built this way, it was founded this way, based on property, based on race, based on gender. And we've managed to somehow balance the gender aspect somewhat, but race and property still are very much the cornerstone of the structuring. So it raises the question, you're talking about, and I think a lot of this happens in political theory, how do you theorize your way towards the possibility of a state that is not enacting violence on the most vulnerable? And then there's the reality of how political change in and of itself happens, which is excruciating. That's why it's called, making the sausage. And you have to be there at every step of the way. I mean, I had to pull back from lobbying because you just have to be able to drop everything, fly to the Capitol, and get in the mix there so that you end up with some semblance of what you were aiming for, because it's an all-out fight among various power sectors and personal and political and corporate interest, right? And if we're going down that route, we end up kind of along the lines of Claude McKay or someone like Saul Alinsky, which is you're trying to theorize strategies by which those without much formal power or gun power can actually engage in that fight, right? And I think for the purposes of this panel here, Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals is really a very important book to read. But he's saying, your power is not what you have, it's what the other side thinks you have. And when he makes that distinction, he's making essentially an aesthetic distinction. He's making something about the style and the illusion that are subtending that. And that's what offers possibility. It's limited, but it gives possibility. But I'm wondering, William, I mean, is there a space between that of the theoretical possibility of a just society and the incredible messiness of human politics over history, right? And that's the big question. Right?
I think, yeah. I mean, I guess I would go back to what I said in closing my remarks, which is that we've never really seen in this country, serious structural reform, serious legal change that hasn't been in response to significant protests and significant mass, mobilization of people around issues. And so I'm certainly not claiming and would not want to try to defend a claim that the state is somehow going to reform itself, right? And that's what I mean when, the question, it is a question. It is a strategic question. It's not a theoretical question. It's a strategic question. Can we take back the power of the state and redirect it? Or is it a lost cause? I think that's the real question that I see looming before us. And if it is basically a lost cause and always has been a lost cause because it was a racial state from the beginning, because it's been corrupt from the beginning and captured from the beginning, then what is the alternative? Given the world that we live in today, right now, with a climate emergency bearing down on us and, accelerating in ways, and all the other problems, of course, that we're dealing with on top of that.
I had a question for commentary for Chon. I really enjoyed, I'm not in the arts, but I enjoyed watching your slides as you talked, and not having you talk about the slides. It was just really, it was beautiful the way you did that. But I also like the way that you began by talking about power as like electricity and infrastructure, which is, I think that's the second definition of power when you look up power, right? It's like, you have the state power and whatever, and then you have infrastructure and physics and so on. And it's interesting because it makes me think about, I was thinking about William's talk as well as yours, and thinking about power in this way, and thinking about privatization, climate change, and the fires caused by PG&E. And it's really interesting to think about power in this way, and the way that the role of the state, the corporate takeover of this electric grid, what it means for climate change, but also what it means for the removal of the state from the control of infrastructure, and then what it ultimately means in terms of climate collapse, right? For us. It's really interesting to think about.
I'm going to extract the question from that and say that I thank you for what you said about the slide presentation. I'd never done one like this. And the goal was not to have the slides illustrate what I said, but to have the slide comment on what I was saying. And then for anybody watching it, you can put together a third narrative, which is how those images relate to you and your sense of them as a progression. So I was trying to do that in some ways as a performance or structuring of my own sense of power, because so much of the discussion of power turns immediately to the areas in which it's formalized.
Right.
And then you immediately get into either a political kind of thinking of strategy or a game theory. how can you work out a scenario in which your desired outcomes, whether they be for personal self-interest or for the greater good, how do you get them to work out? And I find that what happens is so much of the discussion about power is the how of power. How does power work? Rather than what is it that we're looking at here? What is it that we're really trying to understand? And if you look up the definition, power, it's very simple. It's control or influence over others. But the discussion doesn't stick there. It doesn't delve into that dimension. It immediately goes to what you're trying to achieve. And I found that obviously it's where we all live, right? But I found it's also in some ways limiting because it always keeps us in that game. And for me, a main example is something like Walter Benjamin's Divine Violence. 1921, he's ultimately a casualty of the Holocaust, but he's trying to figure out how can we make society better? And how can violence be mobilized to make society better without it being a reproduction of the violence that created the society we're challenging? And he's trying to think it through, and it's the last time he does. He moves away from that and he moves into a much more poetic form of writing that was not about the argument, that was not about the struggle, that was not about manifesting the righteousness of violence towards an end, and more about getting you to think and embrace the ambiguities that exist. And I think going back to this summer, one of the things that was very painfully present was the fact that in responding to what became a national and global protest, the immediate response of institutions and of many of my neighbors was a rush to expiatory statement. Let me get the statement out there that protects me. So it's holding up the words as a badge, when what was being asked for was to sit with the pain, the trauma, and the violence that one group of people have lived with for centuries. And don't try to solve it. Don't try to distance yourself from it. Don't try to claim a moral position toward it. Just try to sit with it for a while. And when you do that, you change. You begin to change. And you go away from that kind of either or dynamic that Claude McKay's writing about, when he talks about that we can stand against the common foe and that we can fight back. It's good and bad. There's no possibility of resolution. That is divine violence. But I think what was being called for this summer, and it really reflects the thinking of a new generation in many ways, say, no, let's just sit here and you be with us. Don't ask me to solve your problem. Don't try to show that you're morally correct, just be with that. And that's really hard. And that's why I pointed out in my talk, and it's really in some ways a very confounding and a sad thing to go through the Constitution of the United States and realize there is no single affect in that entire document. It's all rational. It's all about processes,
I'm going to interrupt you all, but this is a sort of, first of all, a perfect note to take a pause on. Let's be with this. And as well, I just want to say that the three of you have, the ways in which you've engaged one another is really, truly fulfilled the aspirations of 10 questions, that we can come from our different areas of study and find a way in together from using our different perspectives and learning from them. So thank you for that totally robust discussion. But I want to have our audience have a chance to spend some time with this, to slow down and think about what you've been saying. So for the next 12 to 15 minutes, I invite all of us to consider what we've heard about power this evening. Again, to spend some time with it, as Chon reminded us was being asked for and the possibility this summer. Students, you are now going to go to your small group discussion rooms. You have received an email today with the Zoom address to follow, but it's also posted in the chat. So please head there immediately, and then we look forward to your return in the hopes that you'll also pose questions to our panelists and we can ask our panelists. For those of you, or for those of us who are not enrolled students, but lifelong learners spending time with these ideas, that's to say community members, friends, faculty, and colleagues, we invite you to stay put right where you are because you're in for a treat. It brings me great pleasure now to pass the screen to my colleague, Kane, the director of our Visual and Performing Arts Education Program, which is an academic minor in our school and an extraordinary connector to Los Angeles schools. Kevin, hello. Kevin's going to provide a little background about our special partnership with students from the Los Angeles County High School for the Arts. So Kevin, without further delay, the floor or the screen is yours. And panelists, I will rejoin with you, the panelists, and I will rejoin with everyone for a Q&A in about 12 to 15 minutes. Take it away, Kevin.
Thank you, Vic. Yes, I'm Kane, the director of the UCLA Visual and Performing Arts Ed program, otherwise known as VAPA. I'm excited to be here tonight to tell you a little bit about how the VAPA program is partnering with the 10 Questions program this year in an attempt to expand its reach deeper into the community by inviting middle and high school students from 5 Los Angeles public schools to engage in the series. Each cohort of youth has been invited to have their own classroom conversations and create art in response to one of the 10 questions. So for these collaborations, we focused on 5 different questions, working with 5 schools, groups of students and classroom teachers, and representing 5 art forms: visual arts, theater, dance, design, media arts, and music. We share the work with the faculty panelists who are responding to that question, like tonight's panel, and with the UCLA students who are in the course who just left for their breakout room. I can think of no better way to truly consider the import of these ideas than inviting a younger generation of artists to participate, engaging with university students and professors as they make their own work from their own experience in response to these essential questions. After all, these young folks are the very ones that are not only grappling with these questions as part of this project or as part of a class project, but who will actually actualize their possibilities and opportunities in order to shape our collective futures. So now we want to share that work with you, in particular, an extraordinary piece that the Los Angeles County High School for the Arts created, otherwise known as LACSA. If you were with us last week, you saw an incredible display of visual arts from the UCLA Community School. Teacher, Mr. Anthony Mata, and his AP art students responded to the question, what is justice? This week, the LACSA students are responding to tonight's question, what is power? LACSA Shakespeare teacher and friend, Miss Elizabeth Dennehy, who's in the house this evening, somewhere out there, hi Elizabeth, describes the exploration of this question, what is power, through Shakespeare's work and Sir Thomas More. The trick, Ms. Dennehy writes, is to excite the students with those moments when Shakespeare speaks truth to power. And we realize he was actually quite subversive. He was in the pocket of the monarchy and yet bravely asked on stage in front of everyone, what is power? Or as Shakespeare wrote, uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. Ms. Dennehy clarifies that in the Sir Thomas More speech, students examine 4 powers at work. The English protesters rioting against the influx of refugees and immigrants into London, the refugees themselves, and the plea for compassion from Thomas More himself. But perhaps the greatest power of all is the LACSA students themselves, changing the world by breathing new life into a 400-plus-year-old text with their own tongues. They own Shakespeare, by pulling him out of the museum and mausoleum and living his message right now. So thank you, Ms. Dennehy and your students. And with no further ado, I hope you enjoy this piece.
What is power? Or better yet, why is power? Why can't we all be equal? Just because someone doesn't look like you or act like you, or because they're not from where you're from, why can't they be your equal? If Shakespeare was able to understand this in 1516, then why can't we understand this now? Is it so hard for you to put yourself in their shoes and understand how they feel and what they're going through? If you have the power, then why can't you use it to incite change? What is power?
El desalojo de los extraños les concedió ser removidos.
Y concede que este herido tuyo haya reprimido toda la majestad de Inglaterra.
Imagine that you see the wretched strangers.
התינוקות מאחורי הגב שלהם.
E sua bagagem pobre, arrastando-se para os portos e costas para o transporte.
Et que vous asseyez comme des rois dans vos désirs.
Autoriteit keinste Schlägerei.
And you in ruff of your opinions clothed.
Y que tengas tú.
Ik veersterslagen.
You had taught how insolence and strong hands should prevail.
How order should be quelled, and by this pattern not one of you should live an aged man.
Para outros rufiaos, enquanto suas fantasias trabalham, como a mesma mão, ração e direito próprio. Será tumbarão em você.
And men, like ravenous fishes, would feed on one another.
Let me set up before your thoughts, good friends.
You shall perceive how horrible a shape your innovation bears.
What do you to your souls in doing this?
D'espérer comme tu es, lave tes mauvais pensées avec les larmes.
Y esas mismas manos que te gustan los rebeldes al cantar la paz.
Lift up for peace.
A swoje bezecne kolana uczyńcie stopami i klęczcie za swoje przebaczenie.
Tell me but this, who will obey a traitor?
見知らぬ人を抑え、殺し。
Cut their throats, possess their houses.
Say now the king should so much come to short of your great trespass as but to banish you.
Whither would you go?
What country, by nature of your error, should give you harbor?
Nay,
anywhere that not adheres to England.
Bene, allora dovete essere gli stranieri.
Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper?
그 끔찍한 폭력이 터지고.
Would not afford you an abode on earth.
彼らの刑のされたナイフのあなたの脳に当てて、あなたの胃のような借り勝ってる。
What would you think to be thus used?
This is the stranger's case.
Y esta tu inhumanidad como montaña.
Wow, powerful. Thank you. I'm so proud of this group of students in particular, many of whom are in the room tonight. So a really quick shout out, and if I forget anyone or someone's here that I'm not noticing, but thank you, Abby and Jackson and Gemma and Jack and Marielle. There's others. I know you're in here. I see you. Also, I had the privilege myself of teaching this class last year in their 9th grade Intro to Theater class. And I'm so impressed with their talent and their professionalism and their hard work, but maybe most importantly, impressed with their kindness and generosity. They're really wonderful kids who really care about the world around them and the art they're making. And many thanks to their teacher, the wonderful Ms. Elizabeth Dennehy, and to Mr. Monty from the UCLA Community School, last week's partner school. It's an honor and privilege for VAPA to work with teachers that are so dedicated to their students. For those who are wanting to learn more or take a deeper dive into this work of arts education at UCLA and the work we do at VAPA, visit vapa.ucla.edu or follow us on Instagram at UCLA VAPA. Our next school collaboration will be presented on Monday, November 2nd. Very interesting evening for all of us, I'm sure. But we come together when dance students from Marina Del Rey Middle School will share their response to the question, what is hope? I think it's an evening where maybe all of us will be asking ourselves about our capacity to continue to hope. I hope you tune in then as well. We have a few more minutes left before our host and panelists return to take a few questions from our audience and from the students. We hope you'll stick around and enjoy the rest of the evening. And once again, thank you, Laksa, and all the students who are in the room tonight. You did a great job.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the works you saw during our break and have had some time to consider tonight's presentations. We have a number of excellent questions that have begun populating our chat and that students have brought back from their breakout rooms. So we look forward to posing many of these to our panelists. All right, here's the first one. And I just offer this to any and all of us. How do we cope with the fact that for many marginalized groups, the only way to power is either whitewashing yourself or allowing yourself to be a token? How do we allow ourselves to be unapologetic about our culture and ourselves and to strive for justice while we cannot do so on a large scale unless we give up part of our culture? It's a sumptuous question. Thank you for that. And let's just take a moment to invite our panelists to consider it.
I'll give an example out of some of the work I've done. It's a good question. And the idea of proceeding without apology, I think, is a critical part of how. But I helped set up a program it's now at 6 major comprehensive art museums as a pipeline program for young curators. And the idea is to get undergraduates in at their sophomore year to have an ongoing year-long relationship for the remainder of their undergraduate years to apply for graduate school in order to become a curator. And what I noticed happening was that the students, the Black, Latino, Asian American, Native, Armenian, gay, straight, they've really had a sense of thriving and of having a really strong relationship with the museum because they had a pass, they could get in where other people couldn't. And they really, it was the first thing they said. But then when you'd ask them about how do your family and friends feel about that, they'd say, well, they don't know why I'm doing this. I said, what has this museum ever done for our community? And so you have in this person who's about to enter this institution who ideally will become a curator, and they're the only person in that institution that's caught between these two cultural frameworks that don't overlap. That person is the overlap. So it's not necessarily, it doesn't answer how, but it does show the stakes that if you totally buy into the institutional culture, you have failed your community. But if you don't really advance in that profession, you're failing what you can be as a curator. And you have to find the way to bring those together. How do you bring something new into the institution? And right now, and this is happening, but there's not much internal support within these large institutions. They have professional associations, they have this entire apparatus that really points in another direction. And while individually each person may want to support diversity, they don't have the toolkit to really be a part of it along that line, which is where the human is, not where the set of skills and expertise is, but where that person who is a body with emotions, with feelings, and with intellect. And that part is not, you don't see very many places address that. Right now we have stopgap measures, which is, you try to find peer mentors, you try to connect people with people in the profession who may not be at that institution, but can give feedback. And that is so critical. But I think rather than offer an answer, I'll just say you've posed the right question. And that is a challenge that has to be taken up by a much wider group of people than those few who are having to really personally live through that.
Y'all, that was a really great question. I have a follow-up on that, but I'm going to ask the three of you to make your responses super brief because
sorry about that.
we have this silly thing called, an end. So it's not a permanent end. It's just the end of our evening together. So let me see. I don't want to. I've got a follow-up question about students in the institutions. How should they take advantage of the power to better their communities? And I really think these are, sumptuous. We need to spend a lot of time, but I'm going to ask you to be very brief. How can you work within your institutions? Let's just say UCLA, to take advantage of the power to better your communities.
I'm going to jump in quickly. You make a demand. You ground it in your embrace of the common mission that we share. You respond to emails from all of those who are left out. And you do what you can, whatever you can, to help them find a way in.
We heard.
I would say, oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
I would just say, learn how decisions are made and who's making the decisions and how to target those demands.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Jimmy,
I'd say take advantage of the classes that we teach on these communities. and I guess to go back to Pilar's Pilar1's question is the best way is to not be unapologetic, is to be very aware of these histories and movements and so on, right? That make us who we are. And we provide that, the university has a lot of resources, a lot of faculty who provide these courses and so on.
Dr. Pierre, Jemima, continuing, there's a question about Red Summer. In what other ways do today's struggles for power mirror those of that period, 1918 to 1920?
Yeah, well, the reason I talked about the Red Summer, I get the sense that a lot of people thought that the repression, the police repression, for example, of the protests, if we look at what was happening here, what's still happening in Portland, and the potential for violence that we're starting to see. And I felt people didn't realize that there's a long history of revolution and counter-revolution, right? And so what you do see are the rising amount, the amount of violence, right? And that's a very clear parallel to what happened 100 years ago. The rising amount of violence. The protests are very similar. They're bigger and they're different. But I do think, what it does is a response to certain gains, right? So you have, after the election of Barack Obama, seemingly more gains for African Americans, and you have this immediate backlash and counter-revolution, similar to in 1919. Which what's interesting about 1919 is also, remember, it was the flu, this the 1918 flu. So that came at the end of that. So you see the parallels 100 years apart. The flu killed 600 and how many thousand Americans, right? So you think about all these parallels, and the responses to them, I think, are similar, even though the U.S. state is in a different position right now. So it might allow us more room to effect change. I wanted to quickly talk to you about this idea of binary power. The point of the poem for me was not to talk about power in binary terms, right? It was not to say, there are those who are present and there's those who wield power, as much as the poem itself was a rousing recognition of one's power, right? To claim humanity and to demand that kind of recognition, even if it costs death, right? I mean, and that itself is a power, is an empowered position to have when you think about that. And I was just, previewing Kalani Mitchell's question.
And another question for all of you, and very poignant, is how do you personally find power within yourself as you look at the environments in which we're operating? How do you find power within yourself? And this person asks, is it a lost cause?
I'm going to borrow from William, who talked about knowing the way the institution works. You have to know how you work too, rather than assume that you lack something that you see out there as a necessary part of it. Everyone has power, and you can also determine exactly how you articulate that. Is it control other people, or is it influencing a group of people in a situation to move in a better direction?
Yeah, for me, it's just it's gaining more knowledge and also reaching out and having, and reaching out and working with groups. And I think, the mutual aid process is important. I think COVID has done that for some of us. But working in concert with other groups with similar, goals of, empowering everyone in society and making things better for everyone. So for me, it's just been constant study, knowing the history of the US, how we are, how people responded to earlier forms of violence and so on, but also reaching out to other communities that have similar goals of making society better.
Sadly, the last question from our audience, but a very, very important one. How do hope and optimism play a role in power?
Well, for me, no power is complete. No power is, there's always a room to challenge power. Power is not timeless. Power, there's always room to go against power, to speak, as people would say, speaking truth to power. And so power is not this thing that, this entity or this thing that cannot be challenged. The whole point of, for example, Frederick Douglass is, we have to struggle, but you can demand change from power. And so it's not, power is not absolute. No, there's no place where there's power absolute. So there's always room for maneuver. There's always room for revolution. And for me, that's what gives me hope. And we see that from the summer.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I mean, I don't think that there, at least the way I look at it, is really there's not really a way to critique power and to work for change if you don't have hope and optimism. And I think, as Jamima is saying, that no power is complete, no domination is complete. I do think we're seeing, in these new in the protests, both the climate protests and the Black Lives Matter protests, the possibility of different forms of solidarity emerging that is creating, I think, grounds for hope and optimism. And it's impossible to predict where it's all going to go, but I see kind of great energy and great potential power coming out of that then can organize demands, I think, and start to mobilize and perhaps drive real change. I do feel like that, finding hope even in the ruins of this current broken world that we're in is really important if we are going to be able to have a future, a shared future. And I think that's the kind of bigger backdrop to everything we've been talking about in some ways.
I think that these remarks that you're making now are the places we want to end with. And Chon, I just want to leave you a moment to share any last thoughts.
I'm going to put a slight twist on the question of hope, because I think, and I've seen this many times, you're not going to win. It's quite clear that you are going to lose in what you are attempting to do. And in some sense, that is a space of hopelessness. I think where I would locate hope is not in the outcomes and not in the absence of fear, but in the decision to proceed anyway, because you understand this is the right thing within the context you're looking at. It's the right thing for you, or it's the right thing for the world you want to live in. And that allows one, I think, to proceed in a different way than looking for, if we look more narrowly, it's say a hope for outcome rather than a hope for engagement. And that's kind of where I would leave it.
Well, then I think all of us are there with you. We may be looking for that outcome, but we are going to do this to be engaged and to do that together. I want to thank you all for being here with us tonight. And let's depart this gathering with an intention to harness the power and potential of our own actions. At this tenuous and tender time in history, the power of each of our voices to determine our individual and collective futures has never been more important. In other words, please remember to vote. That is the very next act you can make to address state power. And if you need a plan, UCLA has a wonderful resource at bruinsvote.ucla.edu. That's the closest I can come to an advertisement, and that link will help guide you through the process. This concludes this evening's program of 10 questions, What is Power? We hope you will join us again next week for What is Kindness? Same time, new link. And to learn more about the entire series or to RSVP, visit arts.ucla.edu, 10 questions. And lastly, for anyone wishing to continue the conversation, you're invited to stick around for an informal post-show chat with our guests. We'll stay together for a few minutes before everyone goes on to the rest of their evening. However, if you choose to stay, please turn your camera on and use the Zoom raise hand feature found in the participants window to indicate that you'd like to join us. Thank you, and until next week, good night.